You immediately get a feel for how big our nation is and how diverse it is when you go somewhere that's so unlike where you live. It's difficult to realize that this is part of our country too, if all you're used to seeing is rolling hills and pine trees or flat delta land. But it takes no special permits or passports to go where exposed rock is the rule and not the exception like it is back home. We started our journey to the canyons out west from Salt Lake City, Utah, home of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or more commonly known as the Mormons. And if the only contact you've had with Mormons are the young missionaries who drop by your house from time to time, you may be surprised that I didn't see anybody in Salt Lake City wearing a white shirt and a black tie. It's not to say the church doesn't exercise a great deal of influence over the city, and the whole state for that matter, but it's not a religious enclave by any means. Matter of fact, we were told that in the city itself, the population is only about 20% Mormon. Now, proportionally, we have way more Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians here. The heart of the Mormon church is in Salt Lake City at Temple Square. The Mormon temple is on the east side of the square. Construction started in the mid-1800s, and it took 40 years to finish it. Behind the temple on the west is the better-known Mormon Tabernacle. It was built in the 1860s and is home of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. We and about 7,000 other folks from around the world dropped in for the regular weekly broadcast of the choir's live radio and TV program the Sunday we were there. I was amazed that they allow flash pictures and even video recording of the rehearsal of the performance. To the south of Temple Square in downtown is the open-air Town Creek Mall. It fills with shoppers and people milling around, and tourists all day and into the evening, with musicians playing on the street corners and in front of stores and children playing at the fountain. The Wasatch Mountains loom up to the east of Salt Lake City. We'd later in the day pass through the Wasatch some 50 miles to the south of Provo on our way to our next stop and our first look at the sandstone arches at Moab. And then we return to Salt Lake City 10 days later to catch our return flights home. And a little later, we'll do another story from there, but we have many miles to go first. Traveling south out of Salt Lake City, we began to get an idea of some of the ancient geology that went into making up the stratified landscape we'd be seeing over the next week or so. The highway between Salt Lake and Provo runs through the floor of what was once a vast ancient sea millennia ago. The Great Salt Lake is a remnant of that sea. That and the salt deposits that are mined around Moab and stretch all the way back to the salt flats in Nevada. To the east of that sea, the Wasatch Range pushed up from the ocean floor and is the scenic backdrop for the progressive cities and communities that spill out through the valley to the south of Salt Lake City for 50 or 60 miles or so. Then on our way to Moab, we traveled down one of those kinds of highways that you see in commercials or in the movies. A long stretch of roadway with a mountain range at the far end of it. I posted a still shot of one stretch of that road on Facebook, and one of my friends posted a comment on the picture calling it the Thelma and Louise Highway. And perhaps it was, since Thelma and Louise is one of the movies shot in this area. In a few days, we'd even see the cliff their car went over at the end of the movie as we were on our boat trip on the Colorado River at Moab. Here, the roadway took us past a landscape that was so foreign to our pine trees and rolling hills and hardwood bottoms and flat delta land, that all of this could have been on the moon or Mars. All of it was created by forces and counterforces of nature, upheavals and then erosions, revealing layer upon layer of different epochs of creation. Sandy areas that would have been ocean beaches, then salt layers on top of that left behind when sea levels rose, and the ocean that once lapped against the sand covered it. Then it receded, more than once, several times in fact. Our guide in Arches Park advised if we wanted to buy some oceanfront property, get it here in the desert, because the ocean had been here plenty of times before and would no doubt come again. Above the sand and salt or sandstone layers where ancient deserts have petrified, interspersed with layers of gray and green material, which I thought might be copper, but we were told this is unoxidized iron and is included in a layer of volcanic ash that is several hundred feet deep. In this layer of volcanic ash, they find dinosaur bones, and in places where all the layers that have been deposited over it have eroded away, you find dinosaur footprints that would have been left on a vast mudflat in their day, a layer of rock in ours. As we neared Moab, the landscape got more fantastic and got a lot closer to the highway. Buttes and mesas and outcroppings of sandstone towering 1,000 feet over the highway. We were to get a closer view of these sandstone formations tomorrow as we toured Arches National Park, but it had been a long ride since we left Salt Lake City that morning, and we were ready to settle in for the night and get a bite to eat. These may have been the most popular arches in Moab that first night for us. The next morning we were up bright and early for, I guess you could call it, the first official stop of our tour of the canyons out west, although we had already seen a lot in Salt Lake City and on the way through the Wasatch Range to get to Moab, Utah, and the Arches National Park. There are a lot of layers to all these skyscraper formations, but they're mostly sandstone, and delicate sandstone at that. Moab gets just a few inches of rain a year, mostly in increments of less than a quarter of an inch at a time. If the monoliths and arches of Moab had to endure the 30-plus inches of rain a year we get back home in increments of inches at a time, all of this sandstone would have dissolved into sandbars eons ago. But they don't, and it hasn't. The town of Moab itself sits at the surface of a fault between two huge uplifts of towering cliffs of rock, and all of this sits on a 1,000-foot thick bed of salt well below the surface. They mine the salt here, by the way, and it's great table salt. It has a different taste to it and lots of additional minerals. The formation on one side of the fault valley is subsiding, and on the other side it is rising. One side of the valley is hundreds of feet taller than the other sinking side, and the salt formation beneath all of it acts as a buffer for any seismic activity in the region, so the delicate formations still stand. More years of erosion than all of us can really comprehend sculpted the towers and carved the arches in the national park. Park Avenue was the name of the first area where we stopped, with skyscraper shafts of rock zipping 1,000 feet overhead. Our step-on guide in the park, Preston, named off many of the movies that have been shot here. The opening scenes of Raiders of the Lost Ark was filmed in the valley just below us. John Wayne insisted on doing a number of his westerns here in the park and in other areas near Moab. When asked why, he replied that this is where God put the West. Billy Thomas, the father of our pastor back home, Scott Thomas, was with me one day when we went to see the biggest bald cypress tree in Mississippi at Sky Lake Swamp near Belzona in the Delta. And that tree, as big as it is, seems awfully puny against these mammoth formations. Anyway, Billy, upon seeing the tree, commented that oftentimes when he sees something wonderful like that, he hears God whisper to him, "I did that just for you." Well, I felt awfully small and very humbled when I heard those same words in my inner being as I looked at the unbelievably old formations in Arches Park. And these are just what's left after a mile of surface that once was here has eroded away, leaving us these curiosities. The balanced rock. It will fall someday, hopefully not today. The fiery furnace that glows at sunset and can be hiked with a permit, but best with a guide. Double arches. I grabbed this fuzzy shot as we drove past because even in September with school in session, the park was so crowded that there was no place for the bus to park there, so we couldn't get out for a closer look. Of course, over the 10 days we were out west, we discovered the reason for the crowding: international tourists. In many places, if we heard someone speaking English, it was probably someone else in our group. Asia and Europe were the major participants. Someone told me it was because the dollar's so weak against the yen and the euro and what have you, that America is a bargain destination right now. And here they are, coming from all over the world to see where God put the West. Delicate Arch. There are no parking areas near enough to Delicate Arch to allow a hike out to it on our schedule. And even if we had the time, walking a mile to it from the nearest parking lot and back at over 7,000 feet elevation wasn't anything I really wanted to do, even if we had had all day. So we got our best shot from where we were and drove on. And at the end of the day, I wasn't so sure if God had done all of this just for me or not. But at least he didn't leave me out of it. Some of the formations in Arches National Park seem very familiar to us, either from photographs we'd seen of them or from having seen them in the movies. Tall stone structures reaching skyward and the natural arches carved by nature. But here in this part of southeast Utah, nature doesn't only build upward, it builds downward too. And at Dead Horse Point State Park, we got our first look at that downward carving. Canyons cut by the Colorado River, a couple of thousand feet down below us. For all practical purposes, Dead Horse Point looks just like many pictures of the Grand Canyon that you may have seen. Matter of fact, it looks so much like it that the ubiquitous Western movie industry that permeates this part of Utah has used this park as the Grand Canyon in many features. I mentioned the Thelma and Louise Highway a little while ago, but the last scene of that movie, where they drive the car over the edge of the Grand Canyon, was actually shot here at Dead Horse Point Park. Fool me, I didn't know the difference until I got here and heard the story. We were told that our trip on the Colorado River tomorrow morning would bring us back to this point, only we'd be on the river down below. So we'd get the perspective of a canyon from the top and the bottom this afternoon and tomorrow morning. Well, the next morning when we woke up, there was a threat of rain in the forecast, one of those almost non-existent rains they hardly ever get out in the desert southwest. And the rain did come later that day, but that morning the clouds were just what you'd want for photography, just enough to make an interesting sky and dapple the light on the cliffs and canyon walls. The Colorado River was extremely low, we were told, but our boat pilot knew enough about the shallows and deeps to give us a pretty quick ride up the river, then slow down and point out a few interesting hidden spots on the way. Now, for instance, he pointed out this mud container. This is not a natural formation, it's man-made. But our river guide dated it as being over 1,000 years old, made as a storage pot for grain until it was needed by the Native Americans. And he also pointed out the thin white layer of rock about in the middle of this picture. This almost insignificant deposit between layers of sandstone is what brought prosperity to this part of the country. This is where the uranium is found. It's 1,000 feet deep or better in some places. It's right here in front of our faces on the boat ride. And the boat ride, skimming across the Colorado River under some of the most amazing natural scenery you'd want to see anywhere. And on the road, on our way out to the river ride, we stopped and got to take a look at an example of 1,000-year-old graffiti. And we'd see another example of petroglyphs at Newspaper Rock in a few days, but these symbols and figures were etched through the dark layer of desert varnish, which is a coating that accumulates on the surface of the rock as a chemical reaction between substances in the rock and the air take place over about a 1,000-year period of time. So when you see the dark surface like this, you know that it's been exposed for at least that long. Native Americans a millennia ago also scratched back to the bare rock, creating these imaginative symbols. I don't know if anybody knows for sure what they mean, and there's more than the ponderant newspaper rock as we pushed on from Moab. But before we left the next day, a few of us just had to see what the Sunset Hummer Safari was all about. Now, the imagination runs wild. You think of cruising across desert dunes, off-road in a Humvee at the end of the day to catch the last rays of the sun painting the desert. And you think with a name like Sunset Safari, there could even be wine and cheese involved. But then you remember the middle name for this adventure, Hummer. And the first boulder you climb, going up into an area nicknamed both the Devil's Gate and Hell's Revenge, the image of a relaxing ride with refreshments quickly vanishes. Bob Dunaway and Mary Lynn were in the back, and in true Bob fashion, Bob said that this isn't what he had in mind, having Mary Lynn grab his arm and cry, "Oh Bob, oh Bob." And to this day, Joel still doesn't like to talk about this adventure. And our other adventurer, Trish Riley, told the driver when we got back safely delivered to the hotel that she would never do this again in her life. To which the driver proudly smiled and said, "Thank you."
More sky.
As we were leaving Moab for our next stop on our way to the Grand Canyon, the sky lowered to the tops of the mountains as the system blew in from the Pacific and spread monsoon rains over the area. The bottoms of these tropical-type clouds are generally anywhere from about 7,000 feet above sea level to maybe 13,000 feet above sea level. And when you're traveling along a road that's already over 4,000 feet above sea level, they seem very close. Monument Valley was our destination today, but first we would catch up on the latest news of the past 2,000 years at Newspaper Rock. These petroglyphs have been pecked into the face of the rock by a number of cultures over the centuries, including our own, from the date on some of them. I guess those later ones would be more called graffiti than a petroglyph. I don't think anyone really understands exactly what all of this is supposed to mean, other than maybe to say, I was here. Next, we got to see an ancient adobe dwelling at the edge of Cedars State Park. The desert rock formations continued to roll past us, and some of the desert plants were greening up in response to the monsoon showers the past couple of days. At Gooseneck State Park, the San Juan River doubles back on itself so many times that in a mere as-the-crow-flies mile, the river runs a total of over 6 miles. And off in the distance was our next stop, Monument Valley. No telling how many movies from John Wayne westerns to one scene from Forrest Gump have been filmed here. The valley's on Navajo land, as would be much of the road would be traveling the rest of the day and the next day as we pressed on to the Grand Canyon. At breakfast the next morning, we'd meet one of the last Second World War Navajo code talkers still living, Peter McDonald. He not only told us about his experiences in the war, but also told me a little about the meaning of this part of the country to the Navajo tribe.
The most beautiful location in America, in the Southwest. Beautiful because they have unique formation of rocks, mountains, and hills. Although it's dry, although it's some people refer to as desert, but our reservation runs right up to the Grand Canyon, and also Monument Valley, where a lot of movies have been made, and Four Corners, where the 4 states come together. We have 4 sacred mountains that encompasses about 30 or 40 million square acres. And we now live on 18 million acres, shrunk a little bit from where our 4 sacred mountains are. And this is sort of like a holy land to Navajo, and we regard it as such.
Then, after meeting Peter McDonald at breakfast that morning, later that day, we arrived at the Grand Canyon. As we were leaving the Grand Canyon, we stopped by a roadside market to pick up Native American-made souvenirs just above a small, narrow canyon on a branch of the Little Colorado River. Now, if you stopped at the booths and didn't walk on down to the rim of the canyon, you missed hearing the haunting whisper of the wind in the canyon. I thought at first it was the sound of rapidly flowing water, but there was hardly any water down at the bottom. Then it hit me. This is the wind. The desert, and how it exposes the layers of the earth, hinting at how it was all made, was mesmerizing. How the layers have been shifted and tilted by the forces of nature create an aura of awe and wonderment about the mechanics of the planet we live on. And we don't get to see this back home. We have topsoil that hides the bedrock back home. Perhaps they had topsoil here at one time. Perhaps we won't back home in a few millennia. But for someone like me who has always been a geologist wannabe, every mile was a wonder as we traveled from the Grand Canyon to Page, Arizona.
bulbs like this here removed. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this around.
At Page, Arizona, we discovered that the world of the Navajo is ordered into fours and is clockwise in nature.
Plants that are available throughout the Navajo reservation to get these colors.
About 35–40% of our people still do not have running water or electricity. And this structure here would be probably at most on site. This is the type of structure you would find, but there'd be a little bit more material up on top.
Damming the Colorado River to form lakes like Lake Powell was not without controversy, but without the water to make the desert bloom and electricity, this part of the world would not be habitable. After Lake Powell, we were off to Zion Canyon. At the Grand Canyon, we were on the rim looking down. At Zion, we were on the floor of the canyon looking up. Our next stop the next day would be the last canyon on our tour. In between where we were at Zion and Bryce, there was more fascinating landscape. And the cirrus clouds take on a character we don't see back home, here where we are 7,000 feet closer to them than we normally are. Before you've seen them, you may get the idea that when you go out west to see the canyons, you're going to see a bunch of similar scenery. But what could be more different than Arches and Monument Valley, the Grand Canyon and Zion? And Bryce Canyon was different again. After our tour of Bryce Canyon, we enjoyed a Western music show at supper time, and a couple of our own helped star in it. After a good night's sleep, we were back to Salt Lake City again the next day for our flight home. Then the next day we were on our flight back home. And for a while we flew over what seemed to be endless miles of more canyons down below us. Then it was the great American desert over the nation's breadbasket. It's not supposed to be a desert, but it was caused by the drought of 2012. We had to get all the way to Texas before we saw water in any abundance again, and it was Arkansas before we really saw anything green. Then we hit the farmland of the Delta, marked by where the Mississippi River had left behind oxbow lakes and cropland following the outline of the river, and then the mighty Mississippi itself. It was quite an adventure, 10 days visiting the canyons out west, but now we were all but back home again.